Welcome back to Moments That Matter. Over the last few weeks, Ukraine has become increasingly front and center in global news, especially as they are the present target of Russia's aggression. And for those who know Dr. Paul Shotsberger or have been following this podcast, you're well aware of his serving as a missionary in Ukraine from 2002 until 2009. As events have unfolded overseas, I've not only found his wisdom to be incredibly perceptive, but also his foretelling of events has been eerily accurate, truly. Today we have a chance to talk with Dr. Paul Shotsberger and gain a better understanding of what's happening behind the front lines in Ukraine. Welcome, Paul, to your own podcast, Moments That Matter.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate it.
Well, let's first things first, clarify for me, if you will, why I hear people using the term the Ukraine, because you don't refer to other nations as the Mexico or the Nigeria or the America. Why the Ukraine?
Yeah, so this is a holdover from the Cold War that I wish would just go away. Ukraine was known as the Ukraine when it was a territory, when it was a republic of the USSR. And so it was kind of attached, to this greater entity. Since independence, 1991, the correct terminology is Ukraine. And just so, listeners really appreciate why this is important, because for us, it's just an article, what's the big deal? But this is talking about the Ukraine in Russia is one way that the Russians have of either making fun of Ukraine or of, quote, putting Ukraine in its place. Because and what they would say is not Ukraine. And what it means is, kind of like little brother, or still part of Russia, or something like that. In other words, not independent. And this is fundamentally the source of pretty much the entire conflict, because Russia still considers Ukraine to be the little brother.
Wow, very interesting. It seems to be more than just semantics, and it's. I hear different news organizations interviewing people, and they seem to borrow this antiquated term, and I think that clarity is helpful. Well, let's start at the beginning. Maybe you could summarize for us your introduction to and involvement with Ukraine as you started your ministry there in Kyiv.
We were invited to go to Ukraine as a missionary couple, my wife and I, as advisors in February 2002. And we knew nothing about Ukraine. We had no facility with the language. It was literally just to go and help some younger Ukrainians who had this institute, which was a network of Bible schools. And there were some issues, some problems, and they just wanted an older couple to kind of come alongside them. And so we found out about it in February 2002. We made a kind of preliminary visit in May 2002, and by August 2002, we were living there. It was a very quick transition, and so we brought our 13-year-old young son, and it was only supposed to be for a year. I took a year leave from my university, UNC Wilmington, and halfway through, for various reasons and different circumstances, it was just clear to us that we needed to stay. And so I quit my job, and we sold the house, and we stayed for a second year, then a third, then a fourth, fifth, sixth, and a seventh. So we left in 2009.
I love your perspective, and it's been shared on this podcast a few times, and in some of your books you've written so wonderfully about your time in Ukraine. So as we were talking a few weeks ago, you mentioned something that I found was very interesting. A lot of people have been talking about Vladimir Putin wanting to rebuild the USSR. You stepped back a little bit further if you would, for our listeners, take us back to the pre-USSR days. What is the history of Ukraine and Russia? And was Russia even in the picture early on in the history of Ukraine as a country?
Yeah, the original empire was called the Kiev Rus Empire, Kiev being now the capital of Ukraine, Rus being Russia. And that was the case for a long time. And so we're talking about roughly 1,000 years ago, something like that, kind of the heyday of that empire. And so it's important to note that Kiev was the capital and Moscow did not even exist. So you do get a sense of, how long ago this was. It was, we're talking about 1,000 AD, something like that. So when Putin thinks about Ukraine, as I said, they do think about the little brother, but they also think about the fact that the original capital was Kiev. Therefore, Ukraine has not only importance in terms of its resources, potentially today, but also its history. And how can you have a rebuilt empire, which is certainly one of Putin's goals, without having Ukraine? And so Ukraine has just become this sort of apple of his eye in the worst way possible. And it is just, over the last, especially 15 years or so, it's just been kind of one incursion after the next, whether it's political or geographical, militarily, whatever it might be. And he's just been, up to this point, chipping away. And so originally it was politically in 2004 with the Orange Revolution. He had his guy who was president of Ukraine and very much a puppet. And that puppet was ostensibly voted in, and then that election was found to be tainted. And so the people called for another election, and then that president, again, ostensibly was no longer president, and the leader of the Orange Revolution became president. Well, he tried it all over again, Putin, that is, in 2014, and this became known as the Maidan Revolution, and it was the same puppet president. And finally, this guy was kicked out of the country. But in the process of, Ukraine getting a fairly significant victory, what they lost was Crimea. And Crimea became a territory of Russia. And, there are essentially almost no countries that recognize this to be the case except for Russia. But nonetheless, the people there have Russian passports, and it's considered by Russia to be part of Russia. Then came the conflict in the east, and Lugansk and Donetsk, and that's been going on for 8 years. And it, again, is just a way of kind of chipping away at some of the territory. And originally, before this invasion, which has turned out to be literally almost countrywide in Ukraine, the thought was that what Putin was going to go for was some kind of land bridge between the eastern conflict area and Crimea. But as it turns out, he had much greater ambitions, and now he's going for a lot of different parts of Ukraine.
So it seems like this has been building for some time and hasn't just shown up. And in some eerily prophetic words, just a few weeks ago, you told me, watch after the Olympics, because that's when I think something's going to happen. Surely enough, that is exactly what happened. So this conflict really has gone on for quite a number of years and has sort of come to a head recently. In that light, there have been some unlikely heroes that have arisen, President Zelensky being one of them. People talking about his bravery, his attractive good looks, his work in media. Is his establishment as president part of the ongoing poke in the eye of Russia because he's not a bought and paid for pro Russian individual? What was his background and how did all that come to pass?
Well, he's an actor, he's a comedian, and it reminds me very much of the movie Back to the Future, and whoever the character's name is, the young one, trying to talk about 1985, and Doc asks, "Well, who's president?" He says, "Ronald Reagan." He says, "The actor, and who's vice president? Jerry Lewis." And it's kind of like that. The idea, first of all, that Zelensky got elected was kind of amazing, because you have all these professional politicians, and then you have this guy who has literally no experience in politics. And I will tell you that in general, I think the Ukrainian opinion of him was not high. How about that? So he obviously, this conflict has just changed things dramatically for the Ukrainian people. They are quite proud of how he is carrying himself in all of this. And as you say, he's quite good on television and quite good on the internet. And, well, what about that? He's an actor, so in that sense, kind of like Ronald Reagan, he has the ability to really get his message across. Now, the thing about Russia, you are absolutely correct that he is not bought and paid for. In fact, he is very much of, an unknown quantity, and someone that Russia has always looked down with suspicion. Like, they don't know exactly kind of what direction he's going to go. He didn't seem to care too much about Russia, but he wants to keep up relations with Russia, but at the same time, he's talking to the EU, and he wants to be in NATO, and all these kinds of things. So, they knew that Zelensky was not their friend, but they weren't sure that he was their enemy, and so he really kept them guessing until this invasion, and now he's just hardline, and I'm actually surprised in some ways that Zelensky sent a delegation to the border with Belarus to talk to the Russian delegation, because I just didn't think that Zelensky had the time of day for Russia. But he's keeping the door open to the possibility that there may be a resolution to just other than militarily.
This is something I'm a bit fuzzy on myself. There seems to be a lot of blocks of power and sort of jockeying of Russia and Ukraine, and then NATO's on kind of hanging out on the side trying to protect their own interests. And then I saw today that he's applied Zelensky for membership in the EU. What's the balance of all of those together, and what does it mean for Ukraine not to be involved with NATO, but a desire to be a part of NATO? Is that sort of one of the arguments that Russia has made, that they feel encroached upon by NATO? Where does all of that shake out?
Yeah, it's such a complicated situation, and I would say, being as unbiased as I possibly can be, that there is blame to go around to a lot of countries for this situation. It's not just Russia, because in the late 90s, in the 2000s, there was a tremendous expansion, and one would say overexpansion, of the European Union and NATO. It was just kind of a y'all come kind of period. And mostly it was because Russia was very weak. And so people saw their opportunity and just kind of gathered together, with Europe and with NATO. And that's fine as far as it goes. But now Russia is a little bit stronger and is able to have a little bit more influence. And they're saying basically, look, you've taken completely away from us all of the buffer countries, the Baltic countries and Poland and Hungary and Czech Republic, and whether or not they were part of the bloc originally, with the USSR, nonetheless, there was this sense, at least, that Europe was a little bit farther away. It was more Germany, France, and UK, etc. Now, NATO and the EU are on their doorstep. They're on their border. And I've said this elsewhere, but Ukraine, the word literally means borderland. And so it's always been considered somebody's border. And for Russia, I think this is kind of like the last straw. This is that final line in the sand that they cannot. It's unconscionable to them that Ukraine would be part of the EU and part of NATO, and that they would literally be surrounded, because they would be on their west side anyway. And we just have to appreciate one thing that we don't really get over here in America is we've got oceans on both sides of us. And who's going to invade us over land? Is it Canada? Is it Mexico? Yeah, probably not. But for Russia, they've been invaded, and most recently Nazi Germany in the 20th century, and that's over land, and it was just jumping off from exactly where Germany sort of ended, if you will. Their territory that they had taken over during World War II. Likewise, they invaded Ukraine, which is part of the Soviet Union. And so Russia has a little bit different view of the potential of countries invading. We're not even talking about lobbing missiles in right now. We're just talking about a land war, basically what's going on right now between Russia and Ukraine. And it's very, very serious business to them. And so in one way you can say, okay, Putin's really paranoid. He's delusional. They're coming up with all sorts of psychological profiles for this guy, and it may all be true. But at the same time, there's some history behind it. And the people know, especially the older generation, that lived through World War II, or they heard the stories or whatever. They have a different perspective on this kind of thing.
That's very helpful, because I think to the casual observer, it seems like one day Russia just woke up on the wrong side of the bed and decided to do something, and to understand the background, I think, is so significant. Well, if you could look in your crystal ball, here we are, March the 1st, when we're recording this, and this has been going on for 5-6 days. Things are changing rapidly by the day. Where do you see this going forward, and what do you think maybe the coming days or week will hold, especially as you've heard from your friends that are there in Ukraine on the ground now?
Well, everything I'm hearing from people that we know is that Ukraine will never surrender, never give up. Um, and, the news has been obsessed with Molotov cocktails. That's all they can talk about, is how many Molotov cocktails people are making. If it comes down to that, Ukraine will fight on the streets. They will absolutely use those Molotov cocktails. But I saw some footage a couple of days ago that made me think about things a little bit differently. It was a Russian column, and it was a view from a drone, and the drone made a hit, and that column was just obliterated. And I think right now that's the difference. I think perhaps Russia was thinking about Ukraine in terms of the Soviet Union and in terms of Soviet equipment and that kind of thing. But the Ukraine has access to all of the West. the U.S., NATO, equipment, training, and if I could just kind of rewind a moment for everybody. I was in the Navy for 16 years, and most of that time it was during the Cold War. But right at the end, the wall came down, and then the republics of the USSR became independent, including Ukraine. And one of the things that happened almost immediately was that American delegations, including military, were allowed into Russia for the first time to look at some of this military equipment, and not only Russia, but Ukraine and the other republics. And the reports that came back, our people were just appalled. They were like, the ships are rusted out, the military equipment doesn't work, there's no infrastructure, and this is who we were so fearful of, during the Cold War. And so perhaps when Russia thinks about Ukraine, maybe that's what they're thinking about. Well, they've just got hand-me-down stuff, and the people are brave, but they're just going to give up. Well, I tell you what, Ukraine has played it smart over the last 8 years or so of that Eastern conflict, and they've gotten a lot of training and a lot of equipment from the West. And also, by the way, they have access to all of the West's intelligence. So they know exactly what Russia's doing in and out of their country. And so the idea that it's going to come down to a street fight and Molotov cocktails, I think is a little bit misleading. They are brave people, but they're also really, really smart. And so I think Russia heavily underestimated Ukraine. And so for all of those reasons, that's why Kyiv did not fall in, quote, just a few days, as all the news outlets were saying. Kyiv still stands. And, you've got that 40-mile long convoy that's making its way towards Kyiv. But everybody knows about that convoy. Everybody knows the makeup of that convoy. And we are just kind of simple if we think that Ukraine isn't planning a way to get at that convoy before it ever gets to Kyiv. So what do I think will happen in the future? I really don't know. And it would be kind of foolish, I think, of me to try to predict too much. But I will say that, Russia's short-term objective seems to be the encirclement of Kyiv and the replacement of the government. That's kind of been Putin's MO, for a long time now, as well as just kind of, blunt force, used against these cities and the people, just like Syria, just like Georgia. But that's not how Ukraine is thinking. Ukraine is not thinking in the short term. Ukraine is thinking in the long term. And so whereas, Russia may have some tactical victories, Ukraine is going to have the strategic victory. I am absolutely sure of it. It may be sooner or it may be later, but I feel sorry for Russia if they try to control Ukraine as a country, because there will be such an insurgence and such an underground movement, and they will make life for Russia more than difficult. It will just be a place that they don't want to be. And I foresee Russia getting out of Ukraine. Now, whether that happens this week or if it happens, in a few years or something like that, I've been amazed, being honest, that Eastern conflict in Ukraine has gone on for 8 years. I just, it's hard to imagine. So could Russia just sort of take up position, at various places, especially along the north, their border, the Belarusian border? Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible, and just be a thorn in the side of Ukraine. But I think Ukraine sees this as a way to finally get rid of Russia, um, and so I believe that's what's going to happen.
Wow, very telling. And you're exactly right. I feel like predictions were dire early on. Kyiv will fall in 48 hours.
Hmm.
And to see how things have developed has been quite interesting. I don't want to throw a curveball in here, but just to get your thoughts, we're here in 2022 and we're at the apex of development of social media thus far in our world. What role do you think social media has played in this latest conflict, especially for we who are here in the West observing things halfway around the world? What role do you think social media plays in these kind of conflicts these days?
Well, for Ukraine, it's indispensable. I'm sure Russia wishes that social media had never been created, because the news is instantaneous and the requests for help are instantaneous. We just had a request apparently from President Zelensky to Elon Musk. It came as a tweet, but it was almost like a personal message. And, help us with our internet. And then all of a sudden, boom, there's the help that they need. The cyber attacks that have happened lately, Russia attacking Ukraine, these were identified, I mean, literally within an hour, by Microsoft. And within 3 hours, they had, control of the situation, and they were coordinating with the White House. Uh, as far as humanitarian relief, social media has been absolutely essential. And Western money is just pouring in, not only to Ukraine, but also to the countries where people have fled to as refugees, especially Poland, but other countries as well. And so it's like, hey, we need this. Boom, there it is. Hey, we need that. Boom, there it is. Uh, and I'm not saying that they're not in need. There are many people in need, but it would just be so desperate, I think, without social media. And so I consider that to be God's blessing for Ukraine. And that's certainly how I've kept up. There's about 15 friends that I'm just going back to and going back to. Now what's happening, now what's happening. Most of them have fled the country, but there are still some, a couple people in Kyiv, a couple people in Kharkov. And I'm just, asking, is that we're hearing this? Is it true? Or what is the need? Or how can we help? Or how can we pray? So it's made a tremendous difference to me, just feeling connected, to people. And I know that that's true for literally millions of people in America who have some sort of connection with Ukraine.
Yeah, it really has been quite phenomenal to be able to read posts of people who are living in an apartment complex in Kyiv, taking pictures out of their window of the horizon, which is what you just saw on CNN or may see on CNN within an hour or something. To get those updates in real time is quite amazing. We've heard a lot of talk about sanctions that have hit Russia. From a sort of geopolitical side of things, is that enough to deter them, or do they see? I know inside of Russia right now, there's a lot of trouble with people losing access to their funds and all that kind of stuff with all these sanctions that have taken place. Do you think there'll be enough to have an uprising in Russia to alter the plans of the country at large? Or is the overwhelming commitment to achieve Ukraine strong enough to not take into consideration the pain that these sanctions have caused?
Well, you have to know that the interest in taking Ukraine is top down. It's not the people. The people don't understand, in general, why Ukrainians are being killed, why the country is being attacked. Bear in mind that uh, a lot of Russians have relatives in Ukraine, and of course, a lot of Russians also have sons that are fighting in Ukraine. And there's a lot that's just not understood. And you're seeing the protests all across Russia against these, the various incursions. Well, that's just kind of a philosophical, problem. Like, why are we doing this? But then you have the economic problem that is following. When we were living in Ukraine, the exchange rate to the dollar was about 23 rubles. 23 rubles equals $1. Um, the exchange rate right now, I'm looking at it as 113 rubles for $1. The ruble is just crashing, and people are trying to get their money out and they can't. What they're trying to do in Russia desperately is change the rubles to something that has actually some meaning, which would be like dollars or even gold or whatever. And they can't get to it. Interestingly, by the way, the exchange rate in Ukraine has stayed almost the same through all of this. And people still trying to get money out, but it's just a different kind of situation. So the people are feeling this in a lot of different ways, and I'm speaking about in Russia. And is that going to affect the Kremlin? Is it going to affect Putin? That's the question. Is there a line at which, somebody is going to say to Putin, who has his ear, you know what, we've really gone far enough, or maybe we've gone too far. As I understand, some of the oligarchs are balking now at Putin's plans. But to communicate with him, I mean, you may have seen some of the news coverage of his meetings lately with people. He's very far away from these people, and it doesn't have to be somebody from another country like Macron. It's his own cabinet, and he's like almost in another room meeting with them, and it's just really weird looking. So you get the sense of somebody who's very isolated and is going to follow their own instincts no matter what people tell them. So is it possible that the economy would make a difference enough, fast enough, to make a difference in this conflict? That's just an open question. People consider sanctions to be, a long-term kind of weapon to use. They don't consider it to be short-term. So, some have argued, well, then we probably should have started earlier with these sanctions, but it is what it is at this point. So, could it make a difference? Yes, it could. Could it make a difference fast enough? That's the question.
Yeah, good counsel. That's so intriguing. Is there anything that you think Americans would do well to know about the conflict, or maybe something that they're missing, or any additional wisdom or guidance that from your time in Ukraine and your friends there that you think listeners would benefit from knowing?
This is a very resilient people. They've been forced to be resilient throughout their history. This is an invaded country. This country has been invaded every century for centuries, and they have been under various rulers, various empires throughout their history. They have very little history of being independent. And so, but you need to know that their heroes are the Cossacks, and the Cossacks were the freedom fighters, and they are the ones who fought for independence. And the people fighting now, and I'm talking about not just army but civilian, they see themselves as modern day Cossacks, and they are now, they are the new generation fighting for independence. And when you start speaking in those terms, you understand there's kind of almost a destiny to it and a willingness to just take it to the end that may in fact not exist for the Russians. The Russians, a lot of those soldiers are just conscripts, and they don't know what they're getting into. They don't know why they're there. There have been stories of, the Russians just simply transporting these soldiers into Ukraine. They didn't even know they were in Ukraine. Like, hey, go and fight. And when then they find out that they're in Ukraine, then they stop fighting. Because again, there's all this connection, between Russia and Ukraine. So there's just a different perspective, a vastly different perspective between Russia and Ukraine. And this is why I say I don't believe, strategically in the long term, that Russia really has a chance at what it is that they want to do, which is absorbing Ukraine and sort of recreating the empire, because Ukraine just isn't interested. They've had a taste for the last 30 years of freedom, and they know, many of them, most of them, of the older generation, they can compare, what's it been like the last 30 years and what was it like in the Soviet Union. And the young ones have heard the stories, and nobody wants, well, not nobody, but many do not want to go back. There are still some, USSR lovers in Ukraine, but by and large, people do not want to go back. And so they're willing to put their lives on the line. And there's a big question whether the Russians are willing to do that. The common foot soldier, whether they're willing to put their lives on the line like that. It's one thing to lob missiles into a city from a distance. It's quite another to be on the streets fighting. And I do not give Russia a chance on the streets against the Ukrainians. I just don't. But as I said earlier, I think it's not going to come to that, because Ukrainian technology militarily is just so much more sophisticated.
For those who have a desire to put some action to where their hearts are, what are some organizations that could be supported, or maybe some ministries that would do well to receive some funds or some support from our listeners today? What would be a couple places, 2 or 3, that that we could support?
Well, we can put links, in the description for the podcast. But the 2 organizations that I'm associated with are Transforming Nations and Ministry to Educate and Equip. And but I know that there are just many legitimate organizations that are trying to help out. Some are helping on the inside of Ukraine, and some are helping in these other countries, because a lot of the need is for the refugees. There's over 500,000 refugees, and probably getting ready to be quite a few more. And so where do you put them all, and how do you feed them all, and all these kinds of things. And who knows how long they're going to be there. That's the other thing. This whole thing is completely open-ended. Of course, Ukraine itself is going to ask for military assistance and things like that. I don't think the listeners really can help much with that, and we'll let other people handle that. But the the major players, typically for humanitarian missions, are all involved in this. So I don't think it would take much looking around. I do suggest that people check up on organizations, and so you're going to see a lot of requests over social media for funds, and you need to know that you can trust these people, and that they're actually going to get the money where it needs to go, and that sort of thing. I will say also that sadly, because of the effect of the USSR Ukraine does have a history of corruption. And so one of the ways around that sometimes is that you give things and not money. So if an organization is being very specific about the kinds of things that they're going to give to the Ukrainians, that may be a better sign that they know what's going on and they're dealing with the right people.
Well said, and it will be quite an interesting next few days and weeks as we watch this unfold, but I think you've given us tremendous understanding of how we got where we're at and what the future holds. And to you, our listeners, thank you for tuning in once again. You can check the podcast description for a couple of links of some great organizations that you can support, and we hope to see you next time on Moments That Matter. Thanks for listening to Moments That Matter, a podcast that looks at the moments in our lives that come along from time to time that have consequences long after the moment, especially those moments that have to do with the choice of vocation. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation, Parker Palmer speaks of a clearness committee in the Quaker tradition, wherein a group of older, wiser people ask questions of someone considering a life choice as a way of clarifying the next step. We may not meet with a committee about these big decisions, but we all have these critical junctures in our lives, which we can think of as clearness committee moments. We need to pay attention to these moments because they are profound and potentially life-altering. We'll relay stories from our lives and interview others about theirs, especially noting the clearness committee moments, those we choose to recognize and those that were sadly ignored, those decisions that were made with God in mind and those that were not. Our hope is that these podcasts will cause you to think of the same kind of moments in your life with new clarity.